Folks, we are back. The podcast daily is back from the extended 3-day hiatus of last week. Thanks so much for the patience and letting us take a vacation. I promise that him, Bill Landis, and me, Austin Ward, no more days off. It's all downhill from here.
That's right. It feels like we're about at that time of the calendar where we hit the gas and we don't stop basically until like February. So I'm excited, but I have been eager for those times to return actually. So I'm glad we're kind of revving it back up.
Yeah, it was, I think, helpful for us. I hope you all had a great 4th of July weekend. Loved when it sets up like that on a Thursday and you just get a couple days maybe to squeeze in extra vacation. We generally don't take those around here. I can't stress that enough. I know that some of you missed us, and we appreciate that. And the others that thought that it was a well-earned break, we appreciate you even more. But we're going to get right back to it with the State of the Position group. And I'm going to basically ease my way into it by just letting Bill talk about the offensive line for the next half hour. And I'll see y'all later.
Oh, I was wondering. That's a pretty diabolical plan you have there, because I thought before we started recruiting, I said, we're going to talk about receivers, right? Because we've done quarterback, we've done running back. Naturally, you kind of go to the next skill position group. And he said, nope, we're doing offensive line. And I didn't realize that was just so you didn't have to talk for the entire episode.
Yeah, I somehow I didn't rest or recharge my voice, and then had our big golf outing on Saturday, and so just feel like I need one more day to just cruise back into it. Though I do have a lot of thoughts about the offensive line. Yeah, probably not as in depth or as many details as you.
So when I wrote these at Rivals, I broke them down tackle and then interior. Shall we discuss them that way as well? Focus on one group and then the other.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so I think interior is probably more interesting, right? Well, it's the only spot like on the whole team where we're like, we don't know who's going to play at a particular position. So I guess we'll start with that. As I was like writing these state of the position breakdowns, like, I don't know, I found myself believing that Ohio State could have a pretty good offensive line this year. Like, what's the ceiling? I don't know. It's hard to say, but when you think about bringing in a veteran of Seth McLaughlin's experience, sticking him next to Donovan Jackson, who has to play next to a new center for the third straight year, or a third different center in 3 years, but at least this one has like played a lot of football. I think that will help him. And then obviously you got to figure out that right guard spot. But I like the options. I am, what's the right word? Like mildly surprised, I guess, that Ohio State did not seem to project like much panic or even like aggression and in the post-spring window. Not that I thought there were a lot of great options, and maybe that's why, but I felt like their inactivity post-spring was more about them feeling confident in what they had than it was them not thinking that there wasn't anybody who might be worth a look. Because there were probably guys that you could squint at and convince yourself like we should take a flyer on this guy if for no other reason than to add some depth. And they were pretty stagnant. They just seemed like they believed in what they had. So have they earned the benefit of the doubt in that based off how the offensive line played last year? I don't know. I guess it's fair to say that they haven't. But I took that as a reasonably good sign that they like the direction things are headed when it comes to mostly figuring out that right guard spot.
I think there's a notion out there that like, Ohio State didn't do anything in the portal window post spring. It's like, and it is partly because there weren't good options in there. And I think it's also true what you said, that like they feel pretty good about the depth that they have right here. But it would be, I think it's like missing the mark a little bit to think that Ohio State did nothing. Because as you said, Seth McLaughlin is a veteran piece. It just happened so quickly, and it came on the heels of a rough outing, or even maybe a couple rougher outings for him in the postseason, at least by the high Alabama standards. It's like it happened so quickly, and it didn't feel like at the time like, well, he's just here and he's going to start, but he didn't play that well in the championship, in the playoffs. So like, is that all Ohio State could actually do? But that's it was a substantial move. And I'm not suggesting that you're downplaying it or overlooking it yourself, because we know how important that is. But that does have the direct spillover with either Carson Hinsman playing at guard or at least giving them more options, both at center or guard, depending on what shakes out with Seth McLaughlin himself. So I think people wanted. There are people out there, I won't speak for all of them, that thought Ohio State needed to do something in May, and that was more directly related to tackle. But they had already been aggressive and made a move and snapped their fingers and picked up a multi-year starter at center that sort of changed the picture for everything.
Yeah, in an odd way, and this maybe people might roll their eyes at this. Like, maybe the most aggressive posture Ohio State took in the post spring in the transfer portal was adding Seth McLaughlin, right? Because, and I know it wasn't the splashiest addition, and like I obviously, like, Caleb Downs is a better player than Seth McLaughlin. No offense to Seth, but having like a young incumbent returning starter at center, I think a lot of teams are just like, yeah, we're going to develop this guy. He's going to come back next year. He's going to play really well, and we're gonna ride with him. And like, even Ohio State has done that. But no, they didn't do that. They went out and they got a really experienced center. But I wasn't so much on alert maybe for them adding a center, but they saw that as a way to upgrade a deficiency on their offensive line. And could they have been more aggressive? Maybe. I don't know. I think it's easy to say like they could have, they should have. Even like, it doesn't mean, if it's easy to say, it doesn't mean you're going to be wrong. But I think I also get the idea of wanting to let some of these guys like actually show that they're able to take a step forward. And I think with some of them, especially the tackles, which we'll talk about in a second, maybe there's reason to believe that they actually will. But they didn't like leave it to chance at center. They just went out and got a guy who, yes, did not have a tremendous year last year, and like the lasting image of Seth McLaughlin in the Rose Bowl was one that he probably hopes people would soon forget. But 2 years ago, he was pretty good. He was one of the better centers in the SEC. So, what player is he actually? Is he the guy that showed up pretty well 2 years ago, or is he the guy that had his struggles last year? Is he somewhere in the middle? If he's somewhere in the middle, I think that's actually fine for Ohio State. And if he's the guy from 2 years ago, then that's great. He was a guy who was among the best centers in the country. Like, if you look at like PFF stuff, so whatever that might mean to you, we don't have a lot of ways to measure offensive line play other than just sort of watching it with our own eyeballs. But he was a decent center, a better than decent center for probably most of his time at Alabama, or most of his starting time at Alabama. We just all watched that one really kind of horrific game in the Rose Bowl that was an unfortunate turn for not only him. I thought like Alabama's entire offensive line kind of got worked in that game. So it wasn't like it was only his fault, but I think he is a good player. I think he is experienced, which is like tremendous for Ohio State and its offensive line. And I did like in hindsight, I guess I didn't really talk about it as much as the time. Like, in hindsight, I think that was an indication that Ohio State wasn't going to like mess around when it came to putting the best roster together this year. So maybe there are a not insignificant amount of people who think they should have done that with the entire offensive line based off how things went last year, especially based off how the Cotton Bowl went. And if you're using the Cotton Bowl as your starting point, I wouldn't blame you, because that was a horrific display of offensive line play. But that wasn't the way of it for the entire season. I'm not saying they were awesome all year, but they were never that bad all year. And they were probably above average to sometimes like good. I think at times offensive line for much of last season. So I get why they mostly want to run it back, but they did a nice job, I thought, in addressing that one part at center.
There's something pretty interesting about Seth McLaughlin specifically, and Alabama more generally struggling on the offensive line in that Rose Bowl against Michigan, because Ohio State was pretty good for the most part against that vaunted defensive line. They came up one play short, and the offensive line was, I think, more to blame than probably anybody else on that final offensive snap for the Buckeyes. But like, they had stretches where they pounded the running game. Maybe they could have done that more. Maybe not. I don't know. That's I think people would have loved to see more drives like that. Was it seven rushing plays down there pounding in for the touchdown drive in the second half. Like, they held their own, and at times they more than held their own against Michigan's defensive line. And that's, to me, you and I had this conversation, I think, going into spring. It's like, that should probably get more credibility in the conversation about Ohio State's offensive line as we get to the tackles than like concerns about the Cotton Bowl, when that group was not the same from a month prior, and there were also a lot of other pieces on offense that made that more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you don't ever want to assess an area of Ohio State and think to yourself, like, boy, that was a pretty embarrassing display. Because I think that was an embarrassing offensive line display, perhaps the most embarrassing I've seen from Ohio State in
Right.
my time covering them. So it's you don't want to just ignore it completely. There's a lot of variables there. Obviously, like there's a motivation factor. It's a kind of a weird bowl game for a program that strives for more than that. Obviously, they made some changes up front too, had a different quarterback. Like there's a lot there. I don't hold on to that game at all and think to myself, like, yep, that's what that offensive line was, and that's what it's going to be this year, and that's what they need to improve from. Like, that's not the starting point for me. That was just a bad, bad, bad day that Ohio State can't have again. But I'm not necessarily fearful that they will. And frankly, for a lot of those guys, probably going through that experience probably ensures that they won't go through that again. I'd imagine that Josh Frye, Donovan Jackson, Josh Simmons are all pretty pissed off. They played that way against Missouri, and now you have a center with Seth McLaughlin who's probably pretty pissed off with the way he played the last time people saw him. So I think that's valuable. You have to use it the right way, or you have to challenge it the right way. You can't you take that and allow yourself to sort of be I don't know, like taken outside of who you are in a negative way. But I don't know that I'm fearful of that with this group either. So I'm not like a silver lining kind of person. Like like that sucked. That was a terrible performance. I'm not trying to spin it any other way, but
Right.
maybe they can make something out of it. I tend to be optimistic that they will.
Yeah, I hope to. I know you guys love to do the rewatch. I hope you have not rewatched the Cotton Bowl since then.
I have not. I did not go back and rewatch the Cotton Bowl. I might maybe before the season go back and look at some of the defense, because the defense played really well in that game.
Yeah.
Or if we ever get to a point in the lead up to the season where we think like Devin Brown's making another push, like maybe I'll go back and watch Devin Brown. But no, I have little to no interest in going back and watching the way the offensive line played in that game, or the way that mostly just the offensive line played in that game.
Yeah, it was bad. It was one of the worst I've seen in 12 years covering Ohio State. Josh Frye and Josh Simmons were both part of that game, unfortunately for them. But as you said, that could be a little bit of motivation for them, because both of them had some pretty bright moments, and we know that there were some deficiencies at times as well. We talk a lot about the penalties with Josh Simmons, and then the few pressures that Josh Frye gave up pretty much all wound up being turned into sacks.
Yeah, you don't want to be on the other end of that if you're Josh Frye. And that's not to excuse the pressures, right? It's like I think there's a feeling about the way that Josh Frye played last year that is not necessarily backed up by like data or like, and again, the data we have is PFF, and when it comes to offensive line stuff in particular, like it's probably shouldn't take it all as gospel, but use it as a guide. But I also think, like, watching throughout the season, like I didn't think that Josh Frye was a liability all year. There were times where I felt that we like drive the drive where he just like was maybe in his own head a little bit and not playing particularly well. But over the course of the season, he was mostly fine. The thing that was a little disheartening is that it seemed to taper off at the end, or tail off at the end. You don't want that ever to happen, especially with a guy who was playing that position or starting at that position, at least for the first time. Like, you want to see a kind of a gradual build up to something better than what it was at the start of the season, which is what I think we saw that from Josh Simmons. So it's good that we got that out of one of those guys. In a perfect world, you get it out of both of them, and you're feeling like really excellent, I think, about going into this season with those two returning tackles. But you didn't. So like in a weird way, you're left with, I think I sense a decent amount of like one pleasant surprise with how serviceable Josh Simmons was last year, mixed with like optimism about the steps he can take this year, and especially if he comes back for the third year at Ohio State, which he is eligible to do if he decides to do that. And then with Josh Frye, I think a lot of people are questioning whether or not he should play tackle in the first place, and if he is, like, I think a lot of people want to see him like prove that this year. And he's the guy who was the All Big Ten selection, so it's kind of a weird dynamic going into the fall. Like he is the one of the two that I do think questions the answer might be the wrong way to put it, but I think there are certainly a lot of people out there who are wondering just exactly what the ceiling is with Josh Frye.
And I wonder if the way that they have discussed Josh Frye publicly and talked about playing him at guard, experimenting, which again we never saw out of the 5 different days where we had viewing opportunities in spring, like we didn't see that. And Ohio State said that repeatedly, that they were looking at him, considering him for guard. I wonder if some of that is also playing into the way that season ended and motivation. Like, hey, you may have been a first team All Big Ten selection at the end of last year, but the spot's not guaranteed. The portal could be an option. You might have to play guard. I wonder how much of it was real, how much of it was a motivational ploy, how much of it, I'm not sure the answer, because it did seem like every time, again, that we were in the Woody, Josh Frye was at right tackle. And then the way that Ryan Day talked about him, even while still like cracking the door open for the guard talk when we had him available 3 weeks ago, it's like, well, but he's also playing pretty well, and he's a veteran, and he's got a full year of starting experience at right tackle. It would be very surprising to me if they had taken any of those steps to kick him inside.
Yeah, I mean, the only way I thought it was going to happen is if there was like a All-American caliber tackle out there that Ohio State brought in via the portal. If it was mostly just assessing in-house options, and figuring out the right pieces, I never really thought that Josh Frye was going to move to tackle. But clearly, I think it's pretty clear that move the guard. I think it's pretty clear that he's not going to move the guard now, based off just like what we've seen with our own eyes and what Ryan Day has said. And if like all that discussion was in some ways like a motivational ploy, like I think Josh Frye a little better than I do, but I feel like I've gotten to know him like decently well over the last year. He seems to me like the kind of guy for whom that would work. I think some guys might like screw you, like you're going to move me to guard, you're going to bring in somebody ahead of me, like okay, I'm just going to loaf it. And I think like Josh Frye might be like, screw you, watch this, and like I'm going to become a way better player than you guys believe that I am. So that'll be interesting. He hasn't said that, and I don't think he would say that like publicly. But it wouldn't surprise me if he felt a little bit of that. I don't know if you feel differently knowing him a little better.
No, I do think that he's not active and following on social media, but was still aware of like some of the conversations about left tackle or right tackle that we had a year ago. And I'd be like, hey, I said that you could do it. And he'd be like, yeah, but some other people don't think that I can. And he would, I mean, he takes those challenges, and, it didn't pan out perfectly for him. No one here is going to pretend otherwise, but I do think it was closer to a successful season for him than not. And if you can build on that in year two, and he didn't wind up playing left tackle, he played right tackle, but he was very, very serviceable. And that could be even a conservative assessment of that. I know that people are all over the spectrum on evaluating that. And I think, and I've said this repeatedly, if the sacks are sticking in your mind, they're bad plays. Like, I understand why they do. That's an important part of the sample size, but the overall larger one for him is encouraging pointing into year two. I am in the camp, and if I'm wrong, I'll be wrong, that this combination of Josh Frye, a better version of him with a year's experience, and the same being true for Josh Simmons, which let's see him cut down on the penalties. Like, there wasn't a ton of pressures being given up on his side. Like, I'm not going to go as far as saying this is like the best returning tackle combo in the country, because they're probably not, but they're going to be in position to contend for that. And Ohio State could have made some sort of trade or an upgrade in the portal, and they chose not to. And I think that was probably probably the correct decision.
Yeah, and I think when you add like Chip Kelly's point of view to that too, like a guy who knows a fair amount about offensive line play, and like what Ohio State would need to like execute this offense at the highest efficiency possible. And then in lending his voice to that, like they still were pretty confident in those two tackles. Like, I don't know. I would take that as somewhat of an extra endorsement too. Like fresh eyes on the offense, whether even Bill O'Brien, like either way, they were going to have fresh eyes on the offense. And like, does the offensive coordinator have the sway to say like, we need to go get a new 2 starting offensive linemen with Ryan Day? Like, I don't know, but I think there were probably some pretty in-depth discussions about the personnel, both with Bill O'Brien when he got there for the short time that he was here, and certainly with Chip Kelly. Now that Chip is the man on the job. So that, and I think especially with Chip, given his background on like running the football and having some pretty solid offensive lines, that makes me feel a little better about where they're going. I'm in an odd position. Like, this time last year, I was definitely higher on Josh Frye than I was on Josh Simmons. And I think maybe I'm a little higher on Josh Simmons now, but I think both of them in tandem can be. I think there's a possibility that they push themselves in the conversation for like best duo in the Big Ten. Maybe like Oregon's got a really good duo. I don't know. There's some good like individual tackles too in the Big Ten. Guy at USC, guy at Wisconsin, but I think that pair stands to be pretty good. And I wonder like Fryer was the guy who got the vote from the media last year for first team. He was third team on the coaches, and Simmons was more, I think maybe like an honorable mention, or if he got anything at all. I wonder if like you like catch the conference people in the conference in an honest moment and say like, hey, what do you think of these two guys who they might like more going into this season? Because I think with Josh Simmons' athletic ability and the way that he did seem to handle the transition from Group of Five to Power Five reasonably well, there's certainly reasons to have optimism about him. But I don't know. All I know, or I assume anyway, is that Ohio State feels pretty good about the pair, because I just think if they did not, we wouldn't be talking about them. There would be somebody else here, and there's not.
Right. This state of the position is interesting because it's probably the only one where we can go 20 minutes and it's like, well, it's not about the future. It's not about recruiting. Like that could be its own episode though, yeah. Because like you look ahead and okay, Donovan Jackson is going to be gone. Seth McLaughlin is going to be gone. Josh Simmons could be gone. Josh Fryer is going to be gone. Like there is a lot of transition coming, and there have been, some critical evaluations of Justin Frye, and that I think primarily was about the Cotton Bowl. But I think it's important to keep in mind that Greg Studrawa is pretty widely viewed as a less than dynamic recruiter. And this is a position that requires multiple years of development to go play on the offensive line, especially at a national championship or Big Ten championship level. So the job that he inherited was not going to be easy, but that's not to excuse it, because at Ohio State, as Ryan Day will remind Justin Frye or anybody else, they have to win every game, and they need to beat Michigan, and they need to get back in contention for a national championship. And without an offensive line, you're not going to be able to do that. So that job is critical, not just for figuring out who's going to start at right guard for 2024, but what that entire unit may look like in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many Josses. Justin Frye inherited like a decent group of starters in his first year. I think like with Paris Johnson, DeJuan Jones, Luke, like he had 3 NFL guys on his offensive line, 4 because Donovan Jackson's going to play in the NFL. But you knew the bill was going to come due, and like it started to happen last year, and it's going to continue into this year. And whether or not it's fair to lay that at the feet of Justin Frye, like he's the guy now. Like it's his job to make sure that the bill doesn't come due in a way that undoes Ohio State's season. And I think that Ohio State's struggles last year when they encountered him were like more about quarterback play than they were the offensive line. But a better offensive line, I think maybe could have yielded some different results in a couple of games, perhaps. Maybe not. But like you can't just keep talking about that every season. Like we can't go into every season as Justin Frye tries to like regroup from some recruiting missteps under Greg Studrawa, thinking to ourselves like, well, the offensive line just has to be good enough. Like that can't be the standard of success at Ohio State for the offensive line, like that, not at this program. So it needs to be better. I think Justin Frye is very much under a microscope, both this year and figuring out who that right guard is going to be, but especially like in recruiting, obviously, but then even like separately from it, like they could have 5 new starters next year. If Josh Simmons leaves, you're going to have 2 new tackles. You're definitely going to have a new center. And whoever wins that right guard position, whether it's Tigger Chabot, Luke Montgomery, or perhaps Carson Hinsman, any one of those 3 could end up playing a different position in 2025 than they would play in 2024. So there's going to be a lot of moving pieces. It's going to test Justin Frye's developmental skills probably as much as they've ever been tested. And he's also tasked with like restocking that room with the appropriate talent level that Ohio State should have. And I think he's done an okay job with that so far. He's been fortunate, I think, a little bit that Ohio's been pretty good since he got here. Like the 3 guys they added with what was like technically his first class with Luke Montgomery, Austin Sarabelt, and Josh Padilla. Like I like that group. I like Carter Lowe that he's gotten a 2025 recruiting class. like Jake Cook. We like the Jake Cook story. I think Jake Cook can absolutely play at Ohio State down the road. So like he's got some good players, and he's got really good players in 2026 too. So it's lining up for him nicely, but it's going to be a challenge to keep this offensive line play like where it needs to be for Ohio State to accomplish its goals, because like you don't get to hit the reset button. That doesn't exist at Ohio State. So I think there's a lot of pressure on this group in 2024 to play up to the standard and make sure they're not a liability as Ohio State chases a national championship. But then also in Justin Frye to, one, ensure that happens, and two, like make sure that they're ready to handle the brunt of what's going to be a decent size exodus after the season.
Yeah, I was going to say that you look at this group, like there's more spotlight, there's more pressure, there's more scrutiny on it for Justin Frye on the offensive line than anybody else. So I think that's a good way for us to just dive right back into it with vacation in the rearview mirror and get the momentum rolling again on the podcast daily, because we are now well within a month until the start of training camp on August 1st and August 1st. I'll get my voice back soon enough, I promise. We back
I lost
at
my voice too. I don't know what it was about. Like I am
too
much.
Yeah, too much celebrating of the 4th. But we're true patriots here on the podcast daily. Back at Roosters, back with everything else that you've come to expect from the podcast in the days ahead. We're counting down to Big Ten Media Days as well. So it's all coming in July, and then business really picking up on August 1st. Thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for joining us to start this week on the podcast daily for Monday. He's Bill Landis. I'm Austin Ward. So long.